Now muted. This conference is now being recorded.
Hello and welcome. This is Jennifer Mizrahi, founder and president of RespectAbility, a nonprofit organization that is working to enable people with disabilities to achieve the American dream. I'm extremely delighted that we have a wonderful guest speaker today for this webinar that is about strategy amidst uncertainty. Richard Kaipo Lum is an academically trained futurist and chief executive of Vision Foresight Strategy, a foresight and strategic analysis firm based in Honolulu, Hawaii. His professional interests include the futures of governance, conflict and security, and industrialism. Richard has worked with a wide variety of for-profit, nonprofit, government agencies on foresight, strategy development, and strategic thinking. He's worked on foresight and strategy for organizations including the European Commission, the UK government, the US Department of Defense, and PepsiCo. He's helped organize and apply foresight and to develop strategy for endeavors ranging from the restoration of ancient Hawaiian island land management divisions to crowdsourcing foresight development to helping educators in the United States anticipate the long-term futures of learning. He's the author of the new book, 4 Steps for the Future, a quick and clean guide to creating foresight. By the way, you can buy his books on Amazon, and I do recommend them to you. I was really happy to hear him speak at a major conference for workforce boards and leaders who are engaged in planning for the employment of the future. And I really felt that his PhD in political science and his future studies program work that he's done at the University of Hawaii, where he's really worked on really interesting conceptual frames for designing future governance systems, was instantly something that could be helpful to the work of all of us who care about employment for people with disabilities. So I'm delighted that we have Richard Lum, who's a PhD, with us today. So I'm turning it over to Richard so that he can walk us through his PowerPoint and his very visionary ideas. Richard, thank you for being with us here today.
Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon as the case may be. And thank you for that introduction. As usual, I always sound far more impressive than I think of myself as. So thank you very much for that. That was a nice boost. So good morning, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you very much for taking the time to dial in and listen to this talk. As Jennifer was saying, I am Richard Lum. I'm from Honolulu, Hawaii, and I am one of the world's relatively few academically trained futurists. And my firm, Vision Foresight Strategy, does foresight and strategic analysis for nonprofits, for-profits, and government agencies. And what we want to do today is basically I just would like to introduce the idea of what we call futures thinking, along with a couple of simple tools to help do futures thinking and help integrate it with some of the strategic conversations that you are probably having in your organization and help to develop strategy and strategic plans. And the presentation is sort of broken into 3 pieces. And one part of it is about seeing the bigger picture, trying to see the whole picture, as it were. The second part is a little more future-oriented, is about trying to look a little further down the road. And then the third part tries to bring that together in ways that make it sort of easier and more useful for you to develop plans amidst all of the uncertainty and turbulence that a lot of us find ourselves in today. And the presentation today is really addressing this issue of how can we better think about the future? How can we better navigate uncertainty and prepare for the future? And ultimately, how can we better shape futures that we actually want to live in? And so that's some of the tools. That's why we want to talk about some of this stuff today. So I am, like I said, and as Jennifer was mentioning, I am one of the world's relatively few academically trained futurists. And what that means is I come out of a little known and often misunderstood academic field called future studies. And there, at the moment, there's 3 places in the United States where you can get an academic degree in it. The oldest is actually the University of Houston, where, as it happens, I teach the Advanced Strategies course for the Foresight program. The second oldest, and these were both started in the 70s, is the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where I graduated from. And the third is Regents University, which I believe is on the East Coast. And as an academic field, future studies is centrally concerned with trying to understand and anticipate change in society. You know, you look back over the last 200, 250 years or so, and in many cases we've seen a lot of social change and high rates of social change, and a lot of it attributed to technological change. And of course we trace a lot of this back to sort of this big bang, if you want to call it that, of the first industrial revolution, and we do sort of see this spiking of social change. And so today many of us increasingly recognize that tomorrow is not going to be like yesterday. And so today business leaders and organizational leaders are more than ever, I think, concerned with this issue of change and what does it mean and how does it happen and how do we anticipate it. And this is why we have a job today. If you want to understand the field, you can think of it as having two halves, two parts to it. And the first half is the analytic half, and it's using different theories of change and stability and trend research and things like emerging issues analysis and different types of forecasting. First, to try and understand and anticipate change and where could the future go, where could the world go, why would it change different ways. The second half of the field is trying to take the insights from that, or the foresight, if you will, and use it to help clients reframe both their expectations for what could happen and why it would happen, but also ultimately to help them reframe their preferences for the future. And really, in its heart of hearts, future studies as a field is really about this second half. They really, really do, deep down want to get to helping folks rethink basically better futures and sort of see more possibilities and figure out how to get there, rather than taking the future as a given and just accepting the way other people shape it for you. What most organizations, particularly for-profits, come to folks like me for is the first half, and they're really looking for the foresight part. And you can define foresight very simply as insight into how and why the future could be different from the present. And most organizations, even if they don't believe you can predict the future, deep down they're hoping that you can, and often that's what they're coming to us for. Is that first part, is how and why could the future be different? If you want to understand a little bit more concretely what our work looks like or what it entails, you can think about it as having a number of different elements. And when we're doing foresight projects for clients, we'll often start with a historical analysis, because we're often looking back to their industry or their community, and we want to understand how and why have things changed in the past? What were the patterns? What were the relationships? What were the drivers? And not just understanding how things have changed, but also importantly, why did things not change when they didn't change, right? What kept things from changing? What enforced stability? And so you're trying to understand that and use that in various ways to help look at the future and help forecast things. On top of that, we'll look at what we call images of the future. And as a field that looks forward, future studies is somewhat unique in having an emphasis on this idea of images of the future. Now, philosophically, right, the future doesn't exist. You can't measure it. You can't collect data on it. It's not sitting there down the road around the corner. And the way that human beings deal with this fundamental problem, this fundamental challenge with this thing called the future, is essentially through imagination. And we have this ability to visualize and imagine things that haven't happened. And this is the primary way that human beings deal with the future. Each of us can very quickly and very easily visualize what our living rooms will look like when we get home tonight. We can very clearly visualize what our bosses would say and do Monday morning if we didn't turn in the report that's due this Friday. We could absolutely visualize what the future is going to look like for us with regard to our spouses if we choose to go out Friday night and take some clients out for drinking late and not go home and attend to our families, right? So we can easily do those kinds of things, and we do it partly through imagination and creating these images of the future. Now, these images can come from qualitative things, right? They can be visions about aspirational futures, about better worlds that we want to create. They can be driven by anxieties and fears. And they can also be driven by quantitative stuff. So when we're looking at economic forecasts and statistical forecasts, we often are interpreting even that statistical forecasting in imagery, right? We're often taking that stuff and It's creating pictures in our minds about what the future is going to be. And while the future doesn't exist, those images of the future that we carry around and that we create for ourselves have a huge impact on the actions we take in the present. Now, on top of that stuff, as I said, we'll use various theories of change and stability. We'll trend research, emerging issues analysis to create a lot of content and insight. And then on top of that stuff, we'll take all of it and we'll use it in various ways to do forecasting, and increasingly as a springboard for innovation and creativity exercises with organizations. And then when you're really lucky, you get to build on all of that to not just work with a client to reframe or rethink their goals for the organization, but to really fundamentally get in there and rethink their vision for the future, really come up with a more compelling image of the future that they want to go after and create and that they now see as possible. So that's some of the elements of the work that we often do in our foresight projects. Now, stepping back, all of this stuff is, in a sense, what we call sort of futures thinking. And what we're trying to do with clients is help them with this thing that we call futures thinking, which sort of sits in the background. And you can think of it just basically as it's critical thinking about the future, but both in terms of what could happen, but also in terms of what we want to see happen. And so this is some of the stuff that we want to talk about and sort of play with today as we get into it. Now, having, doing all of this stuff with folks like us, what does this futures thinking sort of produce for us? What are the benefits and whatnot? And there is a range of benefits that we can derive from futures thinking, but some of the top things that really pop out for folks is it's often fundamentally about identifying critical blind spots. Futures work and futures thinking is very much about identifying and critiquing assumptions about how the world works and how it's going to change. We're very much in the projects that we do, in various ways you're helping to reduce uncertainty about the future, both because you are identifying more of the uncertainties that are out there and putting them on the map, as it were, but also because with the tools and the approaches, you're actually digging into those uncertainties and getting a better handle on what these emerging issues mean and where these trends are going. You're also, through the projects, not just trying to be defensive and look for threats and challenges, but you're also very much using this, again, as a springboard for innovation and creativity and trying to use it to identify new spaces to go into, new things to create, and just fundamentally get inspired with all of the different things that folks around the world are working on and creating and bringing into being. And those all create opportunities for us, and we're trying to help clients identify those things ahead of time. And finally, through the experience of going through these projects, the teams that get to go through them really do come out the other end with a sort of a shared understanding about the possibilities and the changes that are the future for them. And so those are some of the big gets that we get with some of our projects that we do. Now, to try and sort of visualize what we're doing a little bit, we can use a graphic like this, right? And so this is my version of a cone of uncertainty, and if you ever watched a hurricane track because you were in the path of a hurricane, you'll recognize this. And what you have is in the center line, that dotted line that goes across the middle, that's what we call the reference scenario. That is all of our assumptions, all of the way things are working now, all of the direction things are heading right now, all held constant, right? So just straight line out into the future, nothing changes. Now in reality, that basically never happens, but we often act and make decisions as if that will. And through futures thinking and through the kinds of foresight projects that we do, what futures thinking is really trying to do with folks is take them outside of that band that you see there, that narrow band of low change scenarios. Because in that low band, those low change scenarios, what you're seeing is those are just different futures in which all of those core assumptions about how the world works and where things are going, everything's held constant. Things might be a little cheaper, or they might be a little bit more expensive. They might be a little bit faster. They might be smaller. But all of what we're doing, how we're doing it, why we're doing it, all of those things are held constant. So business models, the way society is organized, its values, all those things, nothing changes in those low change scenarios. And in fact, what we find nowadays is more often than not, we're getting surprised by more high change scenarios where there is more systems change. And so futures thinking, in a sense, is really trying to help clients identify and get into those high change scenario bands to really sort of explore the things that are both more threatening because they're more disruptive, but also that actually offer greater spaces for opportunity and innovation, right? So this is one way to sort of visualize where we're trying to get people on the map with futures thinking. Now, to get to some of the exercises and stuff, or not the exercises, but to some of the points that we want to cover today. The first one being seeing the whole picture. And this is really the idea of pulling back and trying to see a bigger picture. And to do futures thinking well, you really do have to pull back and see more of what's going on. And what we're introducing here is just some systems thinking. And systems thinking has been around for a while now. Future studies as a field, which was born in the 60s and the 70s, absorbed a lot of the early enthusiasm around systems thinking. So a lot of us get taught this stuff. But many of you might be well familiar with systems thinking today. For those of you who aren't, this will be a nice little easy introduction. And so systems thinking really is trying to see the whole from the parts, right? And not just looking at individuals and not trying to understand the situation by looking at individual parts, but really trying to see the relationships and how things flow between them. So it really is trying to see not just the whole, but the patterns that and the bigger outcomes that all of those pieces, as they're interacting, produce. And so you're trying to really sort of see a whole picture. And we can sort of understand system thinking in a few simple points. Again, the system is greater than the sum of its parts. And you cannot understand the whole by focusing on individual parts. And so it's like an engine, right? So if you take an engine block and you take it apart, and you take all those pieces and you dump them in a big bucket, that's not an engine, right? That's a bucket of engine parts. But when you put them back together, when you put them back together in the right way, everything flows and it becomes a bigger thing and it becomes an engine that can drive your car down the road. And so a lot of times what you're looking at is the relationships. You're looking for the interactions and the flows. That's more important often than the individual pieces. And for folks who get into this stuff, there are archetypes that are great sort of generic models of systems that are often very good starting points. And just to give you sort of another way of thinking about it, systems thinking and why it's helpful for us, particularly when we're doing future thinking, is, it's, for example, it's not looking at or focusing on the individual on the factory floor. It's seeing the assembly line. But then maybe it's not the assembly line, it's the entire factory, right? But maybe that's not enough, right? Maybe it's not the factory by itself, but it's the factory connected to all the upstream and downstream supply chains and production processes. But maybe for what you're doing, even that's not enough, right? You pull back further and you see all of those production chains embedded and crossing environments and habitats and human communities and things like that. So again, systems thinking is trying to pull back and see the whole. And to give you a slightly more concrete example, a few months back we had a client that's in one of the cleaning industries, and we were introducing this concept. And so we asked them, hey, what are some of the components of your business? Like, how do you think and talk about the system of your business? And they very easily and very quickly told us, it's things like facilities and products and people and practices. But this is systems thinking, right? So it's all about the relationships. It's all about trying to understand how they are connected to each other, right? But once we have this, now we can start to really sort of pull back and build a map sort of the landscape of the ecosystem. And so we can start to ask what other things are connected to this and impact it, right? So now we have an even more complete map of the landscape. Now somebody like me can come in and start to do our futures research and look at trends and emerging issues, and we have a map on which to paint even more of the things that might be emerging down the road. And once we've gotten to this point, we could probably look at this and call this a map of the emerging landscape. Very quickly, some of the ones as Jennifer mentioned, we're doing a similar presentation at the National Association of Workforce Boards last month. And you guys most of you can probably relate to these. We introduced for them, again, sort of systems thinking and, the idea of first looking at their local ecosystem. So, they're tasked with helping build these local workforce systems, these local workforce ecosystems. And so trying to sort of start this conversation about what that looks like. But then reminding them that they can pull back, right, and see that, even broader environment. And only when we start to do this do we have a sort of complete enough picture that we can start to do some really effective futures thinking, because we now have a map that we can use to do research and look at emerging issues and really have a much more concrete sense of where are things hitting and where should we be looking and where aren't we looking and things like that. So if this part is sort of trying to see the bigger picture, the second part is, of course, seeing ahead and seeing farther down the road. And we, again, use these types of systems maps sometimes as the platform of the springboard to get to that second piece. And so here we're using more explicit futures methods, more explicit forecasting methods and things like that to help clients look a little bit farther down the road. Excuse me. And there are, of course, a wide variety of approaches that we can take for doing foresight work. There are many, many methods. The two that I want to very briefly introduce today are two of the most basic and common building blocks that we'll use when we're doing futures thinking with folks, and they are trends and emerging issues. Somebody like me who does this all the time, you hear me say trends and emerging issues in one breath as if it's one thing, and they're not, and it's important to point out the difference between these two. On the left, we're all very familiar with trends. Trends are historical changes over time. Trends describe history. They describe something that we've decided is important for our issue that we've been collecting data points on. But a trend doesn't talk about the future. The trend may imply something about the future, but trends all break or bend at some point. Now, humans, being who we are, we're very good pattern recognizers and pattern completers. So when we look at that trend graph, we cannot help but put in that fourth bar and extrapolate the trend line, right? But that's a risk, that's a guess. And so we often act or talk about trends as if they are talking about the future, but they're actually just talking about the past. And when you want to go forward, you're talking about a trend forecast, but that's actually something separate, right? The trend line itself is talking about history. Now, when we go forward and we want to talk about what could become important in the future, right? So a trend is something we've decided has been important in shaping change. Emerging issues is us looking forward, trying to but look at some of the things and anticipate some of the things that could become important. They might become trends in their own right, or they might just become very important things that will shape the futures of our issues. And here we are looking for things that are future potential emerging technologies. They are potential public policy issues that nobody's talking about now, but might be critical in future. They're new ideas or concepts that's fringe thinking now, but again, in the future might be mainstream and force all of society to sort of change its values. And so we treat these two things differently. They are two different components. And just to jump ahead a little bit and watching the time. To do the emerging issues part, most folks are familiar with doing trend research and even trend extrapolation. Emerging issues is slightly different. It's a little bit unique to what we do. And the way we get to doing emerging issues analysis and identifying many of these things is through something we call environmental scanning and emerging issues analysis, and we'll use a framework like this. And the S-curve is very common in life, and so when we're looking at the development of a technology, how a technology diffuses across society and becomes mainstream, or how an idea develops and becomes mainstream, often tracks along this curve. So this helps us both identify and look for things earlier or later in their life cycles, but it also helps us plot things in terms of the signals of change that we are finding and trying to figure out where things are. And to give you one example, my professor, Jim Dater, was teaching future studies since the 70s, and I think probably since the late 70s, he's been using as an example of an emerging issue, going up this curve, the idea of the rights of robots. Now, for decades, I'm sure all of us students laughed whenever he introduced this because it's a good chuckle because it sounds silly. Anytime an issue is just emerging, down on the left, the bottom left, it's essentially fringe thinking. It's by definition outside the mainstream. And so it should sound silly. And the rights of robots has sounded silly to most people when we use it as an example. However, today if you go online, you will find serious articles putting forward ideas and making arguments for things like the ethical treatment of robots. Our attorneys talking about how we really have to start to overhaul the legal system and a lot of our regulation to account for semi-autonomous and autonomous machines. And in what is the most sensational one, folks truly arguing for the fact that robots should be allowed to say no, right? Now, it's not a mainstream idea yet. It's not that last circle up on the top right, but it's probably somewhere just below that third circle, right? So this is us tracking issues that become important over time. Again, we get all of our data for this stuff through something we call environmental scanning, and scanning is basically hoovering up lots and lots of signals of change, lots of articles and media and videos, and you're just going over and reading as much stuff as you can get. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through a lot of these things. Some of you are probably very familiar with some of these. These are just articles that I came across. They're in my database just from the last 2 weeks. That just a very quick search tells me like these would be useful for a conversation with folks who are interested in anything really in the disability realm. But there's just a quick example. And so there's lots and lots of stuff. And basically we're hoovering up all of these different signals of change to try and process them and analyze them and see if we can identify true emerging issues in these things. In the interest of time, we'll skip that. We can totally talk about that stuff offline. So some of those first things, these ones right back here, sorry, these are scanning hits, right? So we'll get lots and lots and lots of these. And when we do a scanning project, we've got a database that's full of these articles and hits and whatnot. But we will convert that stuff, right? And we'll come out of the emerging issues analysis having identified particular issues that might be important in the future. Again, these are things that might become trends down the road, or they might simply be really important issues that we have to address or are going to shape the issues that we're concerned with. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip through some of these. Again, if anybody would love to talk about these things offline, I'm very happy to do that. We have lots of stuff like this that we can talk about. But this is the kind of stuff that in the trends and emerging issues research we're trying to kick up to inform your sense of what is possible and what's coming down the road when you're engaged in futures thinking. Now, one of the simple tools we can use to help clients to sort of sort and sift all this stuff are things like this, very simple documents that we'll put together that will, again, using the example from the workforce folks, they have two maps, right? One map, which is the local ecosystem, the local system, which was embedded in broader environment. And so for them, right, tracking what are the trends that are driving change in the local workforce system, and by the same token, what are the trends that have been driving change in the broader environment. And then, of course, we're going to start to plot in our emerging issues. And again, being futurists, we're always going to sort of create these timeframes moving out. And so, what are the emerging issues, not just in the next year or two, but really, what are the emerging issues 3 to 5 years out, more than that? Partly because, it's important to look farther out, but also because increasingly today, I think, emerging issues pop faster, I think, than they used to, say, 20, 25 years ago. And so that S-curve, I think, often gets compressed. And so you don't want to sort of get blindsided. And folks often today will talk about exponential thinking or exponential trends, where things accelerate much faster than intuitively humans are used to guessing. So so now point 3, right? Bringing all of these things together, right? So the first part was really how do we step back and sort of start to see a bigger picture? Second part was, of course, trying to see further down the road. Now, how do we bring that stuff together and how do we integrate them? So what we're doing, of course, is most folks are engaged in their organizations and doing strategic planning, having strategic conversations. And we, of course, would always be in there advising sort of a longer-term view of the goals and objectives that your organization is trying to pursue. Right? And it's not just the things, the strategic issues that you have to address and take care of this year in 2016, right? But of course, it's the next 5 years out, right? What are the things that you want to accomplish? What are the goals that you're really trying to attain in the next 5 years? But then at the same time, not losing sight of the longer-term purpose of the organization and the better futures that the organization really actually wants to bring into being. And so at the same time, getting clients to sort of talk about what are the things by 2030, say 15 years out, that they want to have achieved by that point, right? How do you want to see your clients' lives changed 15 years out, right? What do we want to have accomplished in the world 15 years out? And this is not about setting in stone goals that you're just going to plow forward with, regardless of how things change. This is much more about keeping very explicit in your strategic conversations the longer-term success that you're really trying to create in the world. So, of course, you're doing goal setting and things like that, and then you're taking all of this future thinking that you've been doing, looking at the bigger picture and looking farther down the road, and to start to ask, right, how would those things that we're looking at in the emerging landscape, how will they impact our goals over the next, 1, 5, and 15 years? And then, of course, when we're looking at all of this stuff, right, what are the new opportunities and what are the new threats that these present? What are the new uncertainties, in fact? And one of the things that we've developed to help folks do some of the strategic planning is you've gone through the futures thinking, you've often created all kinds of forecasts and different scenarios about how the future could turn out. And in the process, again, you not only explored some of your key uncertainties in greater detail, but you've often identified even a broader array of uncertainties that are out there that you weren't aware of before. And so you have this challenge of how do we commit to actions in the present that help us actually navigate uncertainty, right, without making us or asking us to place all of our bets in one direction or place all of our eggs in one basket. And we do it through this sort of strategic portfolio approach that we've come up with. And essentially, on the left-hand side, you have commit. And we're going to use beach metaphors because I live in Hawaii. And so, again, going back to the workforce example where they are looking at two views. They're looking at building their local workforce system, but they're also having to sort of pay attention and be in sync with the larger environment. So that first column on the left, commit, is really about diving into the water, either because the urgency is so great or you and the organization are so convinced or so certain that something needs to be done that you have to go in a certain direction, you're just going to dive in, right? You're going to commit to action. You're going to create the initiative. You're going to sell off those plants. You're going to hire those people. You're just diving in and you're committing to it. Now, maybe sometimes you're pretty sure that something's going to be done and you're going to head in a certain direction, but you're not ready to dive in, right? You're a little bit afraid of maybe cracking your head on a rock when you dive in. And so that's essentially when you are at the beach and you get down and you wade in, right? So you're committing to getting in, but you're doing it in a very careful, reasoned way. And this is the domain of pilot projects and experiments and safe-to-fail experiments, right? So you're committing to action, right, but you're not going whole hog, right? Now, sometimes you're not even ready to commit to wading into the water, right? And that's when you get to the edge, walking on the beach, get to the edge of the water, and you just want to try things out. And that really is just toeing the water, right? So this is the realm of, you know what, this looks important. It looks like it might be really impactful for us. Let's get somebody on it. Let's do some research. Let's talk to some experts. Let's collect some data. Sometimes you won't even be at that point, right? Maybe because the issues you're talking about are too immature, right? They're too French thinking. They're intriguing, they're compelling. Maybe they're just not there yet. Or maybe just for your industry, they haven't developed to a point where they're really not going to impact you. But again, there's that thought that it might actually play a role in shaping the landscape in the future. And this is where you are monitoring. Now, all of these things are actions you're taking in the present because whether it's a big change initiative on the left or having somebody monitor and keep track of something on the right, you are about committing to action or resources or attention span, right? So those are all scarce resources in the organization. Excuse me. But again, it's a portfolio approach. So it's about balancing the portfolio for your particular situation and for your particular context. Now, again, sort of stepping back to try and sort of bring all of this, and if you want to think about it this way, the stuff on the left, that commit to action stuff, right, that is, think about it as you are initiating change, right? You're committing to effecting change in some way, either in your organization or in the broader environment. The next two columns are really about helping the organization learn and make sense out of the changes and the turbulence that are going on around you. And the last one really is deferment, right? It's really saying for us, this is too early, but we do think it might be important, so we're not going to throw it off the table yet. So stepping back and sort of trying to bring some of this to a close, trying to see all of these pieces brought together, right? So conceptually, really what we're trying to do is first, again, often trying to help clients sort of see the bigger picture, right? What are the systems? Creating that initial map of the landscape, which of course is a platform for us to go ahead and start to do our futures research and really engage in some futures thinking and, in a sense, again, develop a map of the emerging landscape. All of that is wonderful stuff to help inform our thinking about the longer term and the goals that we're going after, which of course then we can lead into actually crafting strategy and ultimately creating this sort of portfolio of actions to sort of help deal with the uncertainty that we face and whatnot. So this is sort of how this is one way of looking at how we can bring a lot of this stuff together and sort of frame the idea of looking at the bigger picture and developing some good futures thinking, and then leading that into how that influences and impacts both the goals that we want to achieve, but also the actions that we can start to take now in the present to create the better future that we want to create. And that's the end of my presentation. The only other thing I would say is if anybody is terribly interested in this stuff, as it happens, this month, the Hawaii Business Magazine has what turned out to be actually a wonderful article talking about future studies, and particularly talking about the Hawaii program at the University of Hawaii. And it does happen to have me in it. There are other grad students in there, but it is actually a well-written article. It's very nice, and it's a good introduction to future studies and future thinking in general, if you'd like to learn a little bit more very quickly. And it's available online now. So that concludes the presentation part of this webinar. So thank you.
Well, we are so delighted, Professor Richard Lum, for this, and we are going to now take questions. There is in the chat of the webinar the ability for you to type in your questions. And additionally, Virginia, can you tell them how they can dial in with a question if they want to do it by phone instead?
Participants who are listening to audio over the phone can indicate they would like to speak or ask a question by pressing 7# on their telephone keypad. That's 7 followed by the pound or hash sign on your telephone keypad, and we will unmute your line so you can ask your question. Everyone can submit questions using the chat box. Type your message in the input field and press enter to send it.
So I thought this was a fabulous presentation, and I want to thank you for it on behalf of Respectability. And I also want to thank J.P. Morgan Chase, because J.P. Morgan Chase enables us to do these webinars that enable people to think through the big issues and the best practices in terms of employment for people with disabilities. So I want to thank our speaker, and I want to thank J.P. Morgan for that. But I have a first question that I want to start off with. So I just really delighted hearing all these great charts of how we can plan for the black swans and for the wild cards compared to the low change. But it's not like we're ever dealing with just one phenomena at a time. The people that are out working in vocational rehabilitation or disability advocates or workforce boards, they have a whole number of factors that are happening at the same time. So I'd like to give you 3 different factors that I think about when I think about the future and ask you to help us chart out and plan for 3 things that could happen concurrently. So the first thing is that something that we know in your low change, you're no surprise that every year 300,000 young Americans with disabilities age out of school and into what should be the workforce. So that's issue number 1, is the 300,000 young Americans with disabilities that every year age into what should be the workforce, and only 34% of Americans with disabilities are currently working. The second phenomena is that people are living longer and that people are having difficulty saving, and so people are having to work until they're older. So you have more people who, as they are still trying to stay in the workforce as an older American, they are trying to do so while they have an age-acquired disability because physically they couldn't do the kind of job that they might have done earlier. And then the third piece, of course, is the aging baby boom, which means that some larger numbers of people are aging out of the workforce and that there is an increasing labor demand for people who will need to provide health care and elder services to those people as they get older and older. So as you heard, that's multiple things happening at the same time. How do we chart and plan for those sorts of things, plus other multivariate issues that could come along?
Absolutely. To the basic point that organizations today are facing not just one emerging issue, not just one trend or change, but multiple. Absolutely, and that's part of what creates such sort of deep uncertainty for a lot of folks and deep anxiety, because essentially you have so much change going on at the same time. It's turbulence, right? And you sort of interpret it as turbulence, and you really don't have that sort of a handle. And it can be very overwhelming. To go to your 3 points, offhand, what I would say is if we have an organization that is, let's say, looking at all 3 of those at the same time, and not just as a matter of interest, but that because it relates to their mission and their strategy and their operations. Offhand, again, if we reference some of the stuff that we were talking about in the presentation, and let me see if everybody can still see the slides. Let me back up. Back up and see if I can. Here we go. So, if we go back to the idea of sort of systems and sort of mapping the flow of things and how they're related, one very quick initial thought, just listening to these 3 particular issues, one of which is dealing with the youth and as they age out of school and into the workforce, and at the same time looking at it, older generations and their issues with disabilities, and also them aging out of the workforce, right, with the ends, and not just what that does to the economy, but what that means in terms of what the economy needs to provide in terms of new types of services. If an organization is dealing with all of these, again, if you enjoyed sort of the seeing the bigger picture approach, I would say invest some time in mapping this flow out, right? And you see some educational clients, right, who deal with not, say, just elementary, they'll deal with elementary and intermediate and high school and maybe sometimes college. They start to have these maps, these flows about how people progress through systems in different stages to different areas. And I think in a similar fashion, different but similar, it might pay to actually, from a more systems view, sort of map, how youth move through some of these institutions and some of these phases. Again, to get a better picture of how these things are related to each other, to how things flow and interact, and to start to map the other structural elements that impact them, right? And once you do that, again, as a first step, you have a much better sort of springboard for then saying, okay, where should we be looking? What are the places we haven't been looking but are actually part of this system? And then, I think to answer maybe part of your other stuff, let me pop to, right, again, once you have that kind of picture, if I go to, this is the scanning hits screen. Just off the top of my head, looking at some of the issues that you've got here with the youth going into the job market, and only 34% of folks with disabilities have jobs. You've got folks with age-acquired disabilities, and so when you look at some of these scanning hits, right? Again, this is off the cuff, but you can already sort of see things that might pose opportunities for us, right? So you're looking at trends behind these things that are like about automation and artificial intelligence, and some impressive developments in robotics across the board, right? And you're looking at things like down at the bottom where your coworkers and your boss could be robots, right? And so again, the automation side, one of the emerging issues that we're playing with now is really looking forward and looking at how in organizations, companies and organizations in the future, really might be started from the ground up increasingly with very, very lean human elements and an increasing array of autonomous elements and AI and software and machine learning and other things. And so the ability of a very, very small group of folks, or let's say individuals with, and I don't mean to be undiplomatic if I'm being so I apologize, but with folks who may not have a typical array of abilities, really seeing individuals being augmented by machines, broadly speaking, to do physically and mentally and process-wise a great many more things. So it's much fewer people looking and acting like what was a much bigger organization in the past. If anybody ever watched Mad Men, right, it's a fascinating case study in looking at the legion of women they had in those offices typing away all day long, right? You could do all that work with like 5 people today. And so, in terms of individuals who have physical disabilities creating and running very impressive companies, and folks with age-acquired disabilities, all of the stuff that is both mentally augmenting but also physically augmenting their capabilities through adaptive learning and automation and robots and stuff like that. Sorry, I'll stop.
So that's really interesting, and I see that Alexander has a question, which I'm going to get to next, and folks can keep on typing in questions, but I'm really interested in this, you plan for what you plan for, but then there's this black swan or there's this wild card that comes along. And I'll give you just two wild cards that I think about. One is there's a huge amount of conversation about this quote-unquote mass incarceration. We have 2.2 million Americans that are either in prison or jail today. We know that 32% of people in federal prison and 40% of people in jail are people with disabilities. If they start to release large numbers of nonviolent offenders, we could see literally hundreds of thousands of individuals become returning citizens coming out of prisons and jails who have disabilities and whose disabilities were never addressed. So that's not something that people have budgeted for or that they have job coaches standing by. Another thing I think about is disasters, whether it's a 9/11 or a terrorist attack or whether it's a flood like we just saw in Houston or what we had in Hurricane Sandy and others. How do you budget and plan for these very expensive events should they take place, because you don't want to, at the end of the year, not spend your whole budget, because obviously if you don't spend it all and you're the government, next time you don't get that amount of money. So how do you think through something like that?
Absolutely. It's that problem of you do not and you cannot spend your whole budget on essentially contingency planning. I think typically the way, we approach doing that stuff is you're in the process of looking at the environment and trying to understand how and why things are going to change, and you are, ideally identifying things like black swans and potential wild cards and things like that. You can do it in a number of things. On the one hand, something like a wild card really is something that you can think of, but it's so low probability, most people just discount it completely. And the problem, of course, is that if it happens, it's going to be entirely disruptive and really screw whatever you're working on, right? That's the classic idea of a wild card. Of a black swan. A wild card really is something that comes out of left field. So the way we tend to use these, right, to help folks try and sort of cut through the uncertainty, is a wild card. We talk about it as something from within your field. So something like maybe mass incarceration of folks with disabilities. A wild card, in contrast, is something that is from entirely outside of your realm. So it's not really something that you can plan for. And people talk about asteroids hitting the Earth, but again, those are game extincting events, so you don't plan for that stuff. But when you're talking about things like how do we deal with and plan for, what if all of these individuals with disabilities who have never been treated for them are suddenly released back into society, right? How do we prepare for that stuff? And how do we prepare for things that are more black swanish, like extreme weather events and things like that? You are going to delve into each issue individually, right? You're really going to delve into them to try and better understand what really is the probability or the likelihood of each one. So with something like mass incarceration or the release of all these individuals in a very short period of time, again, to me as an outsider, immediately I would say that sounds like something that would be a big policy shift. It would be a big push or a big sort of piece of legislation or something. And so typically we would expect to see signals of that stuff a while before they happen, right? It's rare that stuff just pops. And so delving into it, we can probably start to address, well, what's driving that? What are we looking at? What do we need to monitor? How do we assess how likely that is, right? And that research will influence how much you want to, say, rebalance your portfolio, to use the example we were using earlier. For the disaster stuff, you often, I think, look at it in terms of critical dependencies or critical assumptions. So, companies will, you have a disaster that will take out your headquarters, right? And so that's simply unacceptable, because if that happens, you'd lose all of your data and all of your operations and you couldn't work. So people invest in offsites, right? They invest in backups. But they won't necessarily invest in backups or an offsite duplication of things that are not, again, sort of mission critical, right? So part of the way I think you start to unpack it or peel it apart is to delve into each of the issues. So first, you're identifying all of these potential issues. and then you're going through them and you're assessing them in different ways to figure out either how close they are to you, how likely they are, or simply how critical they are, so that, again, like a black swan event, you simply cannot afford to have that happen. So you have to invest something in it.
Right. So Alexandra asks, what are some best practices or approaches that you'd recommend for when you get skepticism that a new idea won't work within a current modality? On one hand, if you want to take the feedback, but on the other hand, future forward ideas are intended to move beyond current systems.
So best practices for approaches when you get skepticism that a new idea. If we're talking more generally, just in terms of somebody in the organization has a new idea they're looking at the environment, they feel like they're detecting important signals of change that are telling them, hey, we need to do something different, and maybe it's a new program or it's a new business model or side business model that maybe we should start to play with. I think in those cases, from the futures practice, what you often will do is you'll create some contrast for your decision makers to engage them in the idea that change not only is possible, but it happens, and we get caught by surprise. I'll give you, and again, this is a general example because I think you have maybe a more operational or more clinical idea in mind. But say the Department of Defense, right? When we're talking with folks in the Department of Defense, they are very future-oriented, and yet if you think back to that cone of uncertainty, much of what they are forecasting ends up being in that very narrow band. And the argument that we'll make with them, and the picture that we'll paint, is that, hey, look, go back the last 70 years of the Defense Department's history. Go back to 1945 and walk your way forward. Anytime somebody at any point had been talking about a 25-year future, what they would have been talking about would have been very, very off, very, very wrong for the environment that the Defense Department found itself in 25 years later, right? And that is, we lay that out in 25-year increments to demonstrate that, hey, not only does change happen, but it often, the change that we experience, particularly with defense, overturns a lot of assumptions and fundamentally makes them rethink what they're doing, how they're doing it, and how they're organized and all that kind of stuff. And so that we use to engage them in opening up that space for, hey, the scenarios we should be talking about now need to be challenging. When we show you these forecasts, you should feel uncomfortable. If you don't, we're not doing the right thing, and history shows us that. Now, I think you might be speaking more like in terms of a clinical thing. That one I would probably defer a little bit more to, how we go about validating new clinical practices or new programs, healthcare programs, in which we do tend to have a higher threshold in terms of data and outcomes and things like that. But again, from the future side, even for the clinical part, I would say we often try to go into history to try and show our leaders and show the clients how often changes happen, how disruptive it has been at different points, and in fact, so using history to show that we often get it wrong, and so we need to actually experiment and sort of look at these things because our assumptions are often proven wrong as we move into the future.
This is very helpful. I just moved it to slide 23 because I think that Alexandra's question is one that is a complicated and nuanced question, and that I think that anytime you question status quo, whether you're evidence-based or not, it can be met with skepticism or defensiveness. And so I think that, putting things on paper in a chart like what you have provided for us can be very helpful. Operator, do we have any questions that are on the phone? And I just want to remind the folks that are online that they can type in questions. We have just a few more moments.
No one on hold waiting to speak.
Okay. So I don't see at this point any other questions that are in the queue, but I do want to say that this was, for me, a fascinating conversation, and that I'm really grateful to JP Morgan for enabling us to have these kinds of webinars. That the next webinar that we're advertising is really also going to be very interesting. It's about nonprofit organizations and how they can be ADA accessible. But because we do see that a huge number of nonprofit and other organizations are not using even the minimal standards to meet the ADA. And I'm very proud that because of the support that we have, that we're able to have captions, for example, on our webinar that we just did with Professor Lum, because it's accessible for hearing impaired individuals. But I do know that even with in our disability community, that many people are offering webinars that are not offering the captions. And so I want to thank Comfortel for enabling us to have that through their technology, and JP Morgan for funding it. But the ideas behind this that Professor Lum has given us, I think, give us some very, very interesting capabilities. If I can go back to his book, which was right at the beginning, I just want to commend it to you again, 4 Steps for the Future. You can get it on Amazon, and you have right there how you can reach Richard. Again, it's Richard at visionforesightstrategy.com. He actually will email you back. It's just stunning and amazing and beautiful. So thank you very much for being with us today, Richard, and thanks for all who listened in from around the country. Thank you, and this concludes our webinar.